Hi everyone, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. I thought I'd offer a little commentary on a rather entertaining video that I found on the Think Club's channel, which is Adam Friended. And it was a chat he was having between himself and Tom Jump. And Tom Jump and Adam are both atheists, and they have these views on objective morality. They both agree that we have objective morality, yet they don't think that we have a foundation for our objective morality, which of course is God. But I'm going to offer a little commentary on some of this, a couple stops and starts, and I found the beginning particularly entertaining because it seemed like there was a little bit of confusion as far as Tom Jump went. So let's go.
Times on it. But it occurred to me as I talked to more people that there's a conflation going on between objective morality and universal morality. And I'm curious where you come down on the side of that. Like, go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly.
So I'll just define what I consider objective and universal. A lot of times universal morality signifies that we have objective morality. Universal morality would basically be saying that we have objective moral values that apply to all cultures. So they apply across cultures. Now, whether or not people come to accept the fact that we have objective morality, that's a whole other issue. So there's a few issues I want to sort of hash out here. One is moral ontology. So we're looking at moral ontology, and the question is whether or not universal or objective morals exist. And of course, I would posit that yes, they do exist. And objective morality itself is this idea of stance independent. Some people like to say mind independent, but that doesn't really make much sense. It really, to me, should be stance independent. That's what I've seen in the academic literature from people like Sharon Street and others, who's a philosopher. But let's keep going.
Exactly right. In our debates, that was exactly the thing I was trying to explain to you on both times, is that the way you're using the word objective applies to the empirical standard of how it affects societies. But that's not the way the word objective is used in the philosophical sense. When people are talking about objective morality, they're talking about universal morality, right, not just what applies empirically. And you're using it to describe what applies empirically to societies and can allow one to survive longer.
So the question is, for example, do we have objective moral values? And here's some examples in case you're wondering of what objective moral values are. They're things we value, and they stance independent regardless of anyone's opinion of these particular things. So one is we value truth, we value justice, we value equity, we value love. These are all objective, and they do not vary as a function of anyone's opinions. Like the truth is a simple fact. The truth does not vary as a function of anyone's opinion, and we tend to value the truth. Another thing that we value, and we've come to value as humans, and I would say that our objective moral standards are something to which we've been aspiring for thousands of years. But another thing that we value is this idea of human life. So let's keep going. That's distinguished again from universal moral duties. Now that speaks to our prescriptions, not our descriptions. And so universal moral values can be found in psychology, but the prescriptions are something that are particularly interesting, because why would we have these moral prescriptions if we're just fortunate blobs of cosmic splat? So the fact is we have this, and the fact we have a moral compass, and the fact we have moral values and duties to do the right thing, to follow the golden rule, the fact we have all that signifies that there is a creator who is also a moral lawgiver and really cares about what's right, which is why he's aligned our consciences appropriately.
And there's two different uses of the term. So when I say objective morality, I'm talking about it in the philosophical sense. Like
you're talking about universal morality.
Yeah.
Well, why are we not?
So what Adam's a little frustrated by here is that it's getting conflated, this idea of universal morality. Now that has been found in the literature. They have found, I've cited studies in previous videos, the literature that has cited that we have universal moral values. So that's a separate thing. That's saying that something applies to all people across cultures, across generations, across ages, across anything like that. So this is universal, applicable to everybody. And then we have this idea of objective is something that the value itself is stance independent of anyone's opinion. Okay, so that's the distinction that I think they're having a hard time getting at here.
Not separating this out. Why are we not making this distinction here? Objective is a term in science, and colloquially it means, factual. And when you talk about objective morality, you're talking about moral facts, things that can be true or untrue in an objective sense. That's not.
So this is all captured in the literature in the moral ontology framework. So this idea of moral realism is saying there are moral facts, objective moral facts, and then that counters the idea of moral relativism, which is saying that everything is depends on one's culture, what is considered moral. So I reject that. I don't say that there are no relative morals within cultures. I say that that does not fully explain our experience with morality.
Not necessarily a universal sense, though.
Right. In science, they make the same distinction. The difference is that what is objective is the difference. So when we're talking about objective morality,
just so that you know, science actually doesn't study morality. Science is not the place where you go to learn about morality. That is studied in places like psychology and philosophy.
we're saying, does the morality itself exist objectively? And when in science, the objective morality you're talking about is, does the idea of morality have an effect objectively? And those are two different things.
No, we're losing each other here. Just what do you think they mean in science by objective? Something that's objective.
True, independent of mind or opinion.
Okay. There are tons of things that are true, independent of mind or opinion that are not universal.
They're universally true.
Thousands of facts. There are thousands of facts that aren't universal in the same way that gravity
Right.
is universal everywhere in the universe. It is the same principle.
I would have loved it if he would expand it on some good examples for that, because I'm trying to rack my mind thinking of what are some examples of things that are facts that don't apply across all people, wouldn't have applications to everyone in the human experience. So I would have loved that.
Right. That's true. So I mean, when we talk about objective morality, we don't mean universal in that sense.
Let's
Like, that's
take
not,
morality out of the picture now and just talk about
No. So
objective facts.
You made this distinction between objective and universal. Like in
Correct.
philosophy, we don't call it universal morality. That's not the point. We're not saying.
They get a little bit into the weeds in that portion, so I've skipped ahead to get to some really good meat. Here we go.
Yeah, exactly. That's usually what moral realists mean. And so when I use the term objective morality, I'm using it to mean universal in your terminology. And so if I adopted the scientific morality, that would be subjective by that criteria. And so I wouldn't be adopting objective morality. I'd be adopting a subjective morality by those definitions that are used in philosophy and theism, that area of debate.
Do you have, because this is not the form of morality that Sam Harris lays out in The Moral Landscape. I don't know if you've read The Moral Landscape, but
Yeah, his well-being criterion.
yeah, well,
See, the problem with the moral landscape is what Sam Harris does is he says that the humans have a shared experience that we want to maximize our well-being. And he defines well-being as pleasure and happiness. And he's essentially saying that we have this, because he says humans want to maximize well-being, therefore the truth of our morality is also grounded in well-being. So what he does is he has a circular argument. This is saying the consequence and the source are the same thing. And this, of course, doesn't make any sense. So this, and then, plus it doesn't even speak to people who aren't maximizing well-being or don't want to maximize well-being, or it doesn't speak to people like, say, David Wood, who says he's got psychopathy, who basically his idea of what would maximize his well-being is to inhibit other people's happiness. And so, not now, he's how he used to be, how he used to think. So he's since converted into Christianity. Fortunately, now he sees the light. So here we go.
Well, Sam Harris is not laying out a universal morality by any means. He talks about the moral landscape there being many peaks on the moral landscape, not just one. So when you're talking about something that's universal, you're talking about one peak, a Mount Everest of moral objectivism. But that's not what Sam Harris is laying out. So when you say, you're meeting the theists on their turf, Sam Harris is not meeting the theists on their turf. Sam Harris is saying that we can understand morality from a scientific perspective. Many people are.
Yep, he does say that, and that's why no one in philosophy really takes his moral theory seriously, because it isn't answering the question that they're asking. So for the same reason, his theory isn't really considered a moral theory in philosophy, because it's, again, just subjective in the context of how we define those words, not universal.
Right. Okay. Well, it's interesting to get the difference between universal and objective, because I will be using that in all my debates now. But you're not interested so much in the scientific understanding of morality. That doesn't interest you.
Well, it does interest me. I definitely find the origins of evolution and their impacts on society, especially in other animals, very interesting, but it isn't what we're talking about when I'm talking with the.
Let's point out something about evolution. Evolution can help to explain a couple of things. So the fact is that we inherit certain features from our parents in a descriptive way. So for example, if you have empathetic parents, you're more likely to be empathetic. If you have highly intelligent parents, you're more likely to be intelligent. So we have this nature idea, and we also have some nurturing idea. We have the idea that if you're raised in a good family, you've got a lot of different good things going on for you in your life, and you might have an easier life in a way, and so that might lead to certain values. Or if you have a really hard life, it might lead to other sorts of values. So there's a nature and nurture effect. But the thing is with biology is it only explains us descriptively. It doesn't explain these moral obligations that we have, such as the moral obligations to follow the golden rule, which you'll find in virtually every major religion in the world, along with atheism, humanism, and the United Nations, this idea of valuing a moral obligation. The question is, where do those moral obligations stem from? And that's not answered in science. It's not answered by biology. Now, a lot of people like to use what I call post hoc rationalization when they try to say that, oh, one reason why people value forgiveness or value being thankful or value being selfless is because societies cooperated and they evolved that way. And so it was beneficial to us. Now that again is post hoc rationalization and doesn't speak to some of the really big atrocities that happened in the last century, for example, in places like the Soviet Union and China and Cambodia. So this whole idea of trying to rationalize the way that people act based on your theory and fitting everything into the theory is what Rudyard Kipling has called a just so theory. So let's keep going. They're going to get to some really good stuff, so don't hang on with me here because he gets some good stuff. I love when you get to the part about cooperation because I've got a lot of input on that. So here we go.
Theists and philosophers, we're talking about the universal thing. So if we were talking about the evolutionary morality, then it's definitely a topic I'm interested in, but it's usually not the one we go to in debates.
Okay. So you want to lay out your morality just so we can have it here?
Yeah, sure. My morality is that any involuntary imposition of will is immoral. And the reason I got to that is by looking at the evidence of moral intuition and moral progress and seeing where they lead based on the evidence and taking them to their extreme. Like if moral progress was extended to its absolute extreme, what would we expect the world to look like? And that's what I define as the best of all possible worlds.
I'm just going to piggyback on that really quickly because he did mention something that's from an academic study. So there's a study, there's a person called Jonathan Haidt, and Adam likes to reference him a lot. Jonathan Haidt is from New York University Stern School of Business, teaching courses in ethics and other matters, leadership, I believe, too. And so Jonathan Haidt has what they call social intuitionist theory. He's got this idea that we have moral intuitions and moral reasoning, and that's absolutely true. In fact, our reasoning is one thing that distinguishes us from other animals on the planet. We've got this unique ability as humans, as exceptional humans, to be able to reason. But another thing that we talk about in that particular series, this idea of Christian synderesis. So adding to that, our intuitions are always to save our lives. Our intuitions always are for our survival. However, sometimes our conscience tells us that we have to go against our survivalist intuitions and help somebody out who's in a dangerous situation. You see this in war when soldiers take another soldier's bullet. You saw it in Jesus when Jesus was on the cross taking the bullet essentially for us and our salvation. So here we go.
Which is one where there's no involuntary imposition of will.
So how do you're calling this evidence, which I don't necessarily know how you could do that. I'm curious just the specifics of it.
See, using his idea of this voluntary imposition against the will would basically tell me that I'm not able to tell my kids that they have to stop the video games and start working on their homework. That is an imposition on their free will. They don't want to work on their homework. They're being homeschooled essentially right now. And I would be going against Tom's idea of morality by imposing on them the fact that they have to do this thing. Now, this is so I completely disagree with Tom's foundation, essentially.
If you're charting the moral intuition, are you charting moral intuition of all 7 billion people on the planet, just the people that matter?
All of them.
So how
this actually is going to get really, really amusing. This is the good part.
how did you get that metric? Plotting the how do you plot the moral intuition of every person on the planet, and what do? Is there a questionnaire?
Yeah, that's in philosophy, all of the field of ethics and moral philosophy is done based off of questionnaires and moral problems, and they take polls on these things and try to get people's on intuitions and understandings throughout the world and different cultures, and they plot those out, and that's how they use moral intuition as a basis to try and get evidence for moral realism. So I didn't create any new evidence here. I'm just using the evidence that the field of philosophy and ethics uses about morality, which is the intuitions about all the different moral dilemmas and moral problems throughout the cultures throughout time, and referencing the past and predictions into what the future will hold for people's perceptions on those moral problems.
But I don't know that you could call it evidence, though, because I don't necessarily know what study you're talking about. Like, I use Jonathan Haidt all the time. Jonathan Haidt has 65,000 participants in his database. It's a web-based participants, so it's not randomly selected like they normally like to do, but he has a lot of data. They fill out something called the MFQ, the Moral Foundations Questionnaire. There's been a huge study where they gave people the right-wing authoritarian scale, the RAS, I believe it is. And so there's these different questionnaires that people have filled out. What you're talking about, I don't think has ever been done.
No, it's done all the time. It's literally what the people in the philosophers in moral ethics, in the field of ethics do.
Let me clarify some things that are being said here, because I think there's a little bit of confusion. In a little while, Adam's basically going to talk about sampling all 7 billion people on the planet. And no, researchers don't do that. What researchers do is what they call, they sample what they consider a representative portion of a population. Okay, so they sample a population with representative people, and then they consider something they call generalizability. So all the time at the end of academic studies, you're going to find what they call the limitations. And in the limitations, they will talk about how you can generalize from this sample to the population, how you can generalize the results that you found. And so there are some academic studies that have looked at various groups of people. There's scales like the multi-dimensional ethics scale that you can use. I've used it in some of my studies. Excuse me. You can ask people ethical vignettes. I've created ethical vignettes, and I've sampled people on that to try to see what they think about things such as lying and cheating and stealing. There's other things that you can do too to gather information on people. There's a very large group of research under this thing called ethical decision making. So if you want to Google it, you can Google ethical decision making, and you'll see a lot of different tools that researchers have used to gauge people's levels of ethics and to gauge this idea of objective morality as well. So you can go into those sorts of things. In fact, right now I'm currently collecting information on utilitarianism. So I found a really good scale on utilitarianism, and utilitarianism basically is a form of consequentialism, which is consequentialism says you go for the greatest good. You try to maximize the greatest good. Utilitarian takes that same definition and adds for the greatest number of people. So that's something that I've been studying. And what's super interesting is when people have high levels of utilitarianism, that actually correlates more with psychopathy than people who have high levels of deontology, which is the idea of moral duties, following your moral duties. So in a little while, they're going to get in the trolley dilemma, and I will present what the studies have found on the trolley dilemma, which is actually still being used today.
As their job all the time.
They give questionnaires to 7 billion people on the planet. Like, that's a massive undertaking.
No, they didn't give it to literally every person. They give it to demographics of people in every area, in every culture, different questionnaires, different topics, all.
You can go, there's another one that if you want to look this up, it's called the World Values Surveys, and it's out of the University of Michigan by a guy called Ron Engelhardt, and he's done just what Tom is saying. So Ron has actually collected data. He's been doing it in waves of time since 1981. He's collected data from all over the world in a whole bunch of different countries, and he finds people in as representatives of various demographics. And he's got some really interesting results. So you want to see what people's values are, go to the World Values Surveys.
All the time.
So it's like a polling thing.
Yeah, you ask questions to people and you give them problems like the trolley problem and see how people in different cultures will answer the trolley problem, and you compile all the results.
Okay. Is there a possibility that the polling is incorrect? I mean, yeah, okay.
There's always a possibility.
There is always a possibility, and that's where you see in the limitations section, again, of any academic study, you can see where people say, well, there could be plus or minus 2% or something like that of a sampling bias or something like that. So they have that kind of thing listed in the studies, what the generalizability. So that's why a lot of times you want to have repeat studies. So for example, when Ron Engelhardt polls and he finds out there's low levels of trust, and he did find this in places like Italy, especially in southern Italy, they have lower levels of trust. There's an item that's in his questionnaire that basically says, do you think most people can be trusted? And in places like Italy and China, they say that no, they don't think that most people can be trusted. There's lower levels of trust in some of those societies, especially towards outsiders. So if you go to China, which has one of the highest levels of in-group collectivism, this idea of trusting outsiders is not really there. They don't think that outsiders are trustworthy, essentially. Many of them, I'm again generalizing to the population based on what's come out of these research studies. And if we want to see if that's true, we look at, okay, did the study in 1981 correspond to the one in 1990, whatever, I think they go every few years. So you just look at the studies year after year, and if they keep replicating the results, then it looks like you have something that's very generalizable.
Testing is incorrect.
So it's not, so you're saying it's evidence, but it's not evidence that you would bet your life on, let's say.
Well, yeah, there's no proof of objective morality. It's not, in philosophy, it's an unsolved problem. We don't have an absolute solution yet, so it's kind of like trying to answer the question, what caused the Big Bang, or what causes dark matter or dark energy? We don't know. We're just trying to create hypothetical solutions for it. So mine is a contender for a hypothetical solution. I'm not saying I have the solution. Like, I've done it. I've solved the greatest problem in ethics and we can just all go home now. Like, no, this is just a hypothetical solution.
Yeah. So you want to explain the trolley problem? Because I'm not convinced that the trolley problem embodies all there is about morality. And I feel like
you're absolutely right. It doesn't. It's just a single example of a moral problem. There's dozens and dozens of moral problems that we analyze to try and get what moral intuition.
He's going to talk about what it is, but I do want to point out its limitations too. There are a lot of academics who have called for a new, different type of dilemma, because the trolley dilemma they don't feel is something that's realistic to real life, and I totally agree with them on that. So what I did in my study that I'm still collecting data on right now is I just made my own little vignettes of things that actually would occur in your life to determine what people's levels of ethics are towards those vignettes.
Sorry, it's just one of them.
Right.
Yeah, if you want, the trolley problem is if there's a trolley barreling down the tracks and it's going to run over 5 people, and there's a switch in front of you, and you can pull the switch and it'll divert the trolley away from the 5 people, but it'll hit another person instead. Should you pull the lever to save?
Okay, so that's the trolley problem. And I've heard it in different ways. Another way that that's put is that there's a person standing there and you have a choice of pushing somebody, physically pushing somebody onto the tracks to block the train from hitting the other 5 people. So you push one to save 5. That's usually the way that I see this presented. Now, the interesting thing about that is that people who have higher levels of utilitarianism are more likely to push the person to save the 5. That's again, the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. However, people who have high levels of deontological ethics, which is saying you have a moral duty to do what's right, choose not to do anything, okay, because they don't want to harm anybody. So it's just really interesting to look at the results of this.
Save the 5 but kill the 1. That's the trolley problem.
How can we infer any kind of understanding of things like adultery from the trolley problem?
We can't. The trolley problem only applies to the 1 cases of like killing a random number of people.
Right, exactly.
So what we can do to address things like adultery is we go back to our general objective values, and you look at what are our objective values. One is love. One is not be, and that relates to things like don't betray people or don't have an adulterous relationship. So you follow this value of love. If you want to speak to things that happened in the Holocaust, for example, you look at some of the objective values like to life, liberty, the pursuit of freedom. Those sort of things were all violated in the Nazi war. People had been taken imposition against their will, if we want to use Tom's little framework there. So let's go.
So if the trolley,
you get other moral intuitions or moral dilemmas to address different kinds of problems. Like there are moral dilemmas about adultery that you would ask. I don't know what those are particularly because not really my area, but there are moral dilemmas about every single moral question we have, and we apply those to people to see how most people respond to them. So there definitely are moral dilemmas about adultery. That's just not one of them. The trolley problem isn't about adultery.
Right. Can we look over these questionnaires?
Yes.
Do you have access to them? Have you read these questionnaires?
A bunch of them.
So yeah, what you want to do is you can go online. They're in academic studies. One of my favorite journals is the Journal of Business Ethics. And I'm excited to say I have a paper under review there that didn't get desk rejected. So I've got my fingers crossed. But the Journal of Business Ethics is a really good journal. And there's a lot of other ones. There's a lot of good ethical journals out there. Business Ethics Quarterly. There's different ones. So you can go into those studies and you can find some really good information on ethics. So.
I don't have them off the top of my head because
Okay.
it was a while ago, but yeah, they're all on. You can just Google like moral ethics questionnaires or moral ethics evidence. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy just has a list of
I
them.
looked at that because you said in the last debate you said that that was your evidence, but I looked at the moral progress thing and I read the article and it said that the philosophers throughout history have disagreed on moral progress. Even the
Yeah.
philosophers in the 20th century, you know, we had a couple genocides and millions of people dead, and they thought
So yeah,
moral progress wasn't necessarily a thing.
so all philosophers disagree on what moral realism is. Like I said, it's an unsolved problem. It's like asking a physicist what is the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics. We don't know.
It is a really interesting question, though. You say, we assume we're making moral progress, we assume we're getting better, but then you have this huge, massive stumbling block in the 1900s. So we had several massive stumbling blocks to our moral progress. We had the disaster, the debacle in World Wars I and II. We had this whole idea of the Soviet Union, some of the things they did. You know, I was listening today to Jordan Peterson on his discussion on the Gulag Archipelago, and I haven't read that book yet, I have to admit. Solzhenitsyn apparently wrote it, but apparently what he does in this book, this author does, is he was in prison with a lot of these Russian prisoners who were imprisoned completely unfairly and treated completely inhumanely. And he went around to over 200 people and he surveyed them about their experiences, and he documented the whole thing in the book. And of course, at some point he was having a really hard time getting out the book because the KGB was after him. They were throwing people in prison just against their will. Even people who were communist and were party followers, they were throwing into prison. And so some really awful things happened. 120 million people died between Russia, which was also, it was just called the USSR then, China, and Cambodia. And it was some of the practices, like in Cambodia, Jordan Peterson also talked a little bit about some of the things that happened there, like when Pol Pot would actually send the people from the cities out into the countries, take over property. The same kind of thing happened in Russia, that they would take over the farmers' property unfairly and then ship the farmers up to Siberia to arrive there to have no food or shelter or anything like that, and many just died. So thousands and thousands, actually millions and millions of people died last century due to some really egregious things. And I'm not even talking about some other wars that occurred, the Korean War, we have Vietnam War, Iraq, we've got all kinds of awful, awful things going on. So the question is, have we made moral progress? Are we better? Are we better? You know, the US is the only one to have dropped the atomic bomb on anybody. A lot of times the US likes to fancy itself as being the best, but just think of that. That's a little nugget that you need to think about. I mean, I know that this is probably a greatest good for the greatest number of people idea, but again, it happened. It's a challenge. So here we go.
Know yet. They're all disagree on everything. Because it's an unsolved problem, we don't have a consensus solution yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like there's a few scientists that are studying of moral psychology as a cooperation problem. I think they're getting very, very close to understanding morality in detail. So that's one of my differences with you, is I just feel like you're using an understanding of morality that's quite outdated, especially like trolley problems and stuff like that. All that stuff was big in the 1950s, but it's not necessarily the kind of stuff that they're using on moral foundations questionnaires or anything like that.
No, they don't. And the Moral Foundations questionnaire, I actually found that a little bit frustrating and off-putting, because he asked a lot of questions that are really trying to gauge your levels of disgust, like some really gross things, like talking about relationships, sexual relationships between siblings and things like that, that are just completely disgusting. And he was trying to look at how disgusted are you? Are you super duper disgusted? Or are you just kind of disgusted? It's just kind of a strange little questionnaire. But I have to correct Adam on something. In journals today, we're still seeing the trolley dilemma presented still quite frequently.
No, it still is. Like in moral philosophy, that is still one of the big ones. It's still a very good standard of evidence. It's the philosophers and the scientists have different approaches to morality in this case. And I mean, I don't disagree with any of the scientific work that's been done on the origin of morality. It's just, where does that lead? Is it a result of an external force acting on us, or is it purely an internal development from some other thing? Is it a mathematical object, and so that we came up with it, like we came up with math and logic? And
Now, of course, as a Christian, I believe there is an external force acting upon us. That's our moral lawgiver. Okay, so it follows that we have a source of this morality that we have. So it's just like if we have laws out there, the US government has laws, we know that the government's the source of the laws. When you have something like that, we have a moral code, We know that there should be a coder, a source of morals, or a moral lawgiver. Just the same kind of thing could compare with this DNA code that we have. So we've got the Human Genome Project has shown this DNA strand of 3.5 billion well-ordered letters. And so A, C, G, and T, essentially those are they stand for these nucleic acids. And so we have that sort of thing going on. So anyway, let's keep going.
Triangles. Is it the case that those are true independent of our minds, or is it only a societal benefit thing that we made up? That's the difference that isn't being answered. Science isn't answering that question. It's just saying, here's how we came to a knowledge of morality, which you can ask the same thing about how we came to a knowledge of math and logic. Like, you can look at the origins of math and logic. That doesn't mean they're purely made up by humans. They're not subjective. They're still universal. And that's the question the philosophers are asking. Is morality universal like math and logic? Or is it purely just a mental construct like Harry Potter?
See, I think this is fascinating because he's getting to something. He's tapping on something. He's right about this. In the sciences, yes, they've tried to figure out how we've come to these moral values. How do we come to develop this? And of course, the biologists are busy trying to say that it's through our social evolution and it was benefiting to be cooperative. And that's sort of what Adam's getting at, this idea of cooperation between groups. Or within groups. Now, I will actually have to pad that a little bit. I would say that it's definitely any human interactions. It could be dyadic interactions between two people too. So as long as there's more than one person, there's an interaction. That could be a way to develop morals. But this is an epistemological issue that they're addressing, how we came to believe something, how we came to value things like truth. It's not speaking to whether or not truth exists. And that's the point that Tom is making here. He's pointing out an ontological issue of whether or not something exists. And just because of how we came to know that something, that doesn't speak to whether or not the something exists. So for example, I learned math in school in some classes. How I came to know math does not have any bearing on whether or not math exists. So here we go.
And science isn't answering that question. Science is just saying, well, here's how we got to an understanding of morality, just like you can say the same thing about here's how we got to an understanding of math and logic.
Well, I don't think science is particularly interested in answering the question of whether or not it's universal.
Yeah.
Like, who cares? Like, if this seems to be the take these days of people studying moral psychology and studying morality, that morality evolved to bind individuals into cooperative groups. That's like the reason. That doesn't
how we got to it.
So what is your why is that an important distinction to you? How we got to it versus what it's useful for. Like, society still needs to be sustained.
It's not how we got to it for what it's useful for. It's how we got to it and whether or not it's true independent of mind. So if, like, we got to math and logic through a specific set of sociological changes and people inventing different aspects of math and logic, but that how we got math and logic doesn't make a difference to the question of, is math and logic true independent of humans?
I'm not talking about that question though. That question is immaterial to what I'm talking about.
That's the distinction. That's the distinction we're making. It's not.
But you're saying how we got to it.
Yeah, that's the scientific question that we're asking about morality when we do the scientific research. It's how we got morality, and then
actually the question is really whether morality exists, whether objective morality exists. And one of the things that Tom does a little bit here, to me, it seems like a little bit of conflating between this idea of universal versus objective. And so at the beginning of the video, I did go over that. So anyway, I want to thank you guys for coming here. Please like and subscribe and do come again. I just wanted to just wrap this up, basically just telling you that objective morality is stance independent morality. It's saying that we have these objective moral values of things such as truth, life, liberty, the pursuit of justice, freedom, all those sorts of things. And then there's this idea of universal, and that's saying that the values are applicable to everybody, okay, applicable to whatever population you have, whether or not it's people in the United States at certain ages or whatever, but it's applicable worldwide, so it's globally applicable. So that is the bottom line. And so I really appreciate you coming by. Please like, subscribe, do come again.